Hello and welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their career-defining drug, song and book and also share their joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Professor Neal Maskrey. Neal is a Professor of Evidence-Informed Decision-Making and a retired GP. We will welcome Neal in a moment as he shares a drug for our formulary, his career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. For our micro-discussion, it's still a Sunday Times article from the start of this year. The NHS is flatlining. Here's how to save it right now by health editor Sean Linton. For the observant of you, a few bottles of our Oral Apothecary NHS Tonic were given a limited edition release to celebrate 75th birthday of the NHS. Did you spot it? But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening, how are you doing?
Yeah, good.
I was going to mention, I mentioned last pod, my dad had a stroke and I thought I'd just mention it because we talked about shared decision making a lot on the pod, and so I've experienced or observed firsthand, I suppose, the impact of a lack of, because he's had great care. It's been pretty good. I think probably clinically all the guidelines have been followed. When he's needed scans, he's had them. He's had physio. But it's being done to him, not with him, is the only way I can describe him. And he's getting very sort of frustrated. So even though he's getting good care, he's getting is angry the word, but frustrated, and he is just a bed number, it feels like. So I was just going to mention that because we've talked about it a lot this series, and I've seen it firsthand, and it's really frustrating.
So, Paul, is it because he's an oral apothecary listener that he's frustrated? Because he's heard all the stuff that we talk about all the time. Like, my parents are fed up. They ask me anything about their health. I'll go, well, you need to ask them what the bran is, don't you? And they're like, remind me what that is? I was like, oh, for goodness sake, benefits, risks, alternatives, doing nothing. So is it anything to do with that, or is it just genuinely...
I'll tell you one example is, I won't go into the clinical details, but
Sure.
one of his medications was stopped in the middle, quite appropriately, but there was no conversation with him about him. It just wasn't there in his pot one morning, and then there was no one for him to ask about what was happening and why it wasn't there and what the reason was. And it's little things like that can sound trivial when you're, on the big picture.
Up.
When I found out, it was stopped for the right reason, but there was no conversation about it. So and you get to see the impact that has on someone who's used to being in control of their life, having that control taken away.
Okay, here's the thing. Do you remember that you two took the piss out of me when I used the analogy about people in a hospital not being in their own habitat? Do you remember I said they were like zoo animals?
Do you know what?
And do you know that you two took the piss out of me? Has this got something to do with it?
Yeah, I think you're spot on.
Okay. Hopefully he's getting better, and also your mother-in-law, because she also was had a fall,
Yes.
didn't she?
Yeah, she's home, so that's good. So sorry, that was on a bit of a downer, but on an upper, we had a conference in work today. I work in quality improvement, and it was a celebration of all the projects that we've done over the last year. So it was really good to get involved in that. And so it's been a busy week. How about you, Steve?
I'll give you another parent story then. I got a phone call from my dad about 11 o'clock last week, I think it was the week before, really panicking. And I thought, oh, here we go. And he said, oh, you got to help us. What? Well, your mum went to take a Senecot tablet, and we think she's taken my hearing aid battery. And obviously we shouldn't laugh, but so I'm calmly, looking it up on Talkspace, thinking that's fine if unless you're a child, etc. And then basically about 5 minutes later, he went, "Oh, it's okay. I've looked in the bin. She hasn't swallowed the battery. I don't know what she has swallowed because the Senna's still here. But anyway, that was a bit of fun."
Have you got their consent to share that story?
Yeah. And the other thing, I hate NHS terminology, so this isn't no word of a lie. I heard it on a podcast when I was driving to a meeting, and then somebody in the meeting used this terminology. So do you remember during COVID, they always used to talk about the COVID cell? I used to think that was really weird, and now instead of a group that are getting together to make decisions about stuff, and because of all the recovery and all the issues around workforce and workload, they said, oh, well, take that to the war room. And I said, what? And I hadn't heard it until that point, and that's the second time in one day that people were talking about a war room. Has anybody come across that yet in the NHS?
Yes.
That's wrong.
Yeah,
It's wrong.
it's been for a while.
Okay.
So, public workshop in Porthcawl YMCA last Friday night, talking about Bran. Great turnout as well. Great conversation with university or U3A crowd. That was great.
Oh, yeah.
And then look, so I'm going to bring up, I've got a parent story this time for the change as well. NHS birthday on the 5th of July. It was Mike Hayes' birthday on the 5th of July also. He's 84 years old. So that day I went to the NHS 75th birthday conference set up by the Bevan Commission, and listen to this for a stellar lineup. Professor Sir Michael Marmot, Lord Nigel Crisp, Professor Sir Chris Ham, Baroness Finlay, Dame Sue Bailey, Professor Donna Hall, Professor Sir Don Berwick, Professor Sir David Haslam, and Professor Derek Feely. Chaired with style by Oral Apothecary alumni and Bevan Commission co-chair Chris Martin. So here's a quiz question for you. Throughout the 2 days of the conference, take a guess who had nearly, if not more, mentions as Nye Bevan. Who do you think they mentioned? Nye Bevan came up a lot, obviously.
Wes Streeting?
No, he's Welsh.
Oh, not the person that can't be named.
I'm not going to say it.
Julian Tudor Hart.
Oh, okay.
The episode that needs to be made.
Julian Tudor Hart. There we go. That story's for another time. Let's move on. It's our great pleasure to welcome Neal Maskrey to the Oral Apothecary. Neal was a general practitioner on the east coast of Yorkshire for about 20 years, the last 8 of which he also worked for North Yorkshire Health Authority, helping to develop primary care in the county. He then spent a decade as the medical director of the National Prescribing Centre, followed by becoming programme director of the Medicines and Prescribing Centre at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Gradually, Neal worked out that understanding how humans make decisions was a very important thing, and that making decisions for populations is very different from making decisions for individuals. And finally, look, I mentioned it last time, Neal is a mentor, wise counsel and friend to many of the listeners of this podcast. Welcome, Neal.
Oh, bless you, Jamie, and bless you, Oral Apothecaries. I'm a big fan of this podcast. I followed it from Series 1, Episode 1, but I still have Claire Howard as an earworm in my ear when she said it's all a bit blokey.
Yeah.
Well, I've got news, Claire, with me as the guest. It's old blokey. We've been working to try and keep it in the present and look to the future rather than in the past. So you'll have come across ChatGPT, guys. Yeah. There's an artificial intelligence thing. So I put into ChatGPT a sort of opening remarks for a podcast with some apothecaries. And this is what I got out. I'm exceedingly gratified to have been afforded the honour of addressing such a distinguished assembly. I trust that the discourse I shall present will prove enlightening and perhaps even edifying as we consider the virtues and foibles of our society with all the perspicacity and wit we can muster. Isn't that great? But it took ChatGPT about 6 goes, and I had to put in the style of Jane Austen before it got anywhere near what was required for apothecaries.
I think that's the first time we've had the word perspicacity on here as well. I can't even say it.
Yeah,
just as well.
Absolutely.
So, Neal, look, if we bumped into you in a bar, a pub, or a coffee house, what would your story be? Now, I've got a little bit of insight, or we've got a bit of insight, because you've recently been working on your story. Tell us more.
Well, I spent about 10 years trying and failing to write a book. And I finished it 2 weeks ago and sent a draft around to a few people, including Jamie, who's passed it on to you guys. So I'm in the market for a literary agent and a publisher. If anybody listening is interested, give us a shout. And if all that fails, I'll self-publish on Kindle. It's called Rebalancing Medicine. So it started out as we found cognitive psychology so helpful in understanding decision making, and it started out as a sort of a description of how cognitive psychology helps us understand how decisions are made, why there are differences between the evidence and what people actually do. And it was an absolutely terrible attempt at a book. Nobody would have read it, including me. And then I had another go, and it turned into a bit of a textbook, and me telling people what to do, and that was hopeless. So finally, I worked out that telling stories is good. So we've ended up telling stories. It needed to be personal. It needed to be about stuff that's happened to me and to people close to me, as well as some stories about key things that have happened in medicine and so on. So hopefully it's a sort of this is how it's been for me. This is how medicine has ended up in this situation. This is why it's not great in some aspects, and this is what we might do about it. So we'll see.
So Neil, before we rip into the book, no, I'm joking, but what I find strange is, because I've only met you a couple of times, but I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, and as in your written work, when you've written in journals or when you worked for the MPC, for example. So I find it slightly strange then when you said that you found it so difficult to write the book, because you've always been so eloquent, and I don't just mean eloquent, but I'm also a fan of analogies, and you've done some brilliant stuff in the past. And the one I remember most about you is RNLI, and this idea that information has to come from research, doesn't it? Then it has to go to national, then it has to go to local, then it has to go to individual, and that's still with me. And I always quote that and say that's Neal Maskrey. But so you did lots and lots of that. So I just found it surprising that you found it so hard to write a book.
Well, I guess I was working hard at it to try and get a format that would be a popular science type thing. So this isn't any sort of a technical thing about the practice of medicines or prescribing or evidence base this is a story that's trying to grip people's hearts and minds. So slightly out of my comfort zone, I guess, to get there. And of course, things like, work and family and little things like pandemics get in the way. So, yeah. And there's always too much to do, isn't there?
So I've read it, Neil. I think it's great. And so the literary agents out there should be beating a path to your door. And I expect to see it in an airport. Maybe when Steve and I are flying out for the World Cup in a few months, maybe a bit soon, okay? But I expect to be seeing it on. And do you know what? That conference that I went to last week, that's what it was crying out for, that we need to rebalance medicine. That, so I think you're definitely onto something. It's a great read. I read it in 3 sit-ins, 1 on the train and then 2 when I was back home.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. That's lovely to hear.
Can I share something with you? It's another parent story. It is, look, because I did ask Neil this. I as soon as I read it, I thought, oh, Mike Hayes, 84 years of age, would love to read this. So I passed it on to him. So he sent a note back to you, Neil, okay? And here's the note.
Okay.
And so here's the context. It's 1961 to 1965 in Sully Hospital. My dad had recently graduated from Cardiff Uni with a microbiology degree. He was working as a research assistant to the consultant pathologist at the time, and his area of research was farmer's lung. And then my father goes on, then one morning, unannounced, a sharp-suited gentleman entered my lab and with outstretched hand introduced himself as Cochrane, Archie to friends. He grabbed a lab stool and said quite simply, right, I know nothing about your subject, bring me up to date. My dad goes on to say he tried his best and Cochrane seemed satisfied. He did not make a single interruption, but asked very politely, how do you know you're adopting the right approach? Thereafter, every 3 or 4 weeks, he would pop into my lab and ask for updates. I soon got to know his interests were of methodology, proper, meaningful controls. Compared to his research teams, we were minnows, but he was still keen that we were doing things properly. He didn't like loose ends. My dad goes on to say, he did make me think, never made me feel small, had a very light touch when admonishing others, and I soon looked forward to his flying visits and the frequent social evenings at his home when he entertained cohorts of overseas medics over here to further their knowledge of either research methodology or tuberculosis. So that's my dad's memories of Archie Cochrane. So you mention him several times for obvious reasons in the book.
That's lovely, isn't it? That is just great.
Yeah, I didn't manage to read all of it, but I've read the second half because I figured that was the bit that, was where you would really come out fighting in relation to how you thought we might be able to move it forward. And I suppose it was as a group of people who have spent most of their however many episodes we've done talking about the need for using evidence-based, but but being very, very grounded in the idea of shared decision making and people's values and preferences. That comes out very, very strongly. And having now spent the last 7 years working in general practice, knowing now that I knew you were a GP, but I now see the connection there now because I see it in my own practices. I see that value, and I suppose the bit that is the tricky bit, isn't it? And you're good enough to come out and say, well, actually, what are we going to do? Because we've got 10% of all the healthcare posts that are unfilled. And it's not just here, is it? It's around the world. And therefore, we have to have a good, close, hard look at what we're actually doing versus what people, the whole wants and needs thing, essentially, isn't it? And so, yeah, there were overtones probably, I guess, to like the David Haslam book where he's saying, well, you can't have everything. And it's that kind of grown-up conversation that I think that we don't know how to have it, do we? We don't know how to get the public engaged in the idea that, well, maybe the preventative stuff is going to need to take a bit of a back shelf because we need to deal with all this acute stuff, or we need to deal with all the backlog of all the operations. But as soon as you start talking to anybody, I guess it's the whole world of being a bloody politician, is that everybody just is interested in their own little world, and therefore you can't get enough people to see further than the end of their nose.
The whole thing is inherently complex. Well, let's take a couple of big themes. Let's take uncertainty and probability. So we do the first modern randomized controlled trial of streptomycin in 1946. And that was really, a great triumph, but it was also a missed opportunity because we then explicitly have people who were in the streptomycin group who didn't get better, who died. And we had people in the placebo group who did get better. And the big lesson from that is that you can't predict what's going to happen to an individual patient. There's stochastic uncertainty, unresolvable uncertainty. And so the whole practice of medicine is based upon probabilities, and we're trying to improve the probability of a good outcome rather than guarantee it. But because we're based on science and technology, and people believe in new science, new technology, it's bound to work, and we build the whole thing up, and actually it's all a bit of a built on really quite shaky foundations. And if we talked more openly about probabilities and less about certainties, I think that would be a good start. But we're a long way from recognizing that amongst healthcare professionals, and I think, Jamie, about the public as well. It's Jamie's thing about most medicines don't work for most people. Although I've got one later that does.
I'll give you come in. There was a statistician in the audience on Friday night, and so he wanted to have that very conversation. Gimmo, what have you got?
I want to thank you, Neil, because I sort of the NPC and the work that you and others did there was a huge influence for me, and it comes back to the work that we're all trying to do. We talk about in the pod around behaviour change and stuff, and you and the NPC were pioneering that sort of stuff. You started off with ChatGPT, and one of the things I remember from some of the sessions we used to have is you can't possibly synthesize all the information that's available to make a decision, but now we've got something that maybe can. And so there's two ways to look at ChatGPT, and it's going to take over the world and kill us all, and we're all going to be slaves, or actually it can work with healthcare professionals to enhance our decision making. I'm in the latter camp, but a little bit worried about the former camp, which is why I've got a shed full of beans. But I just wondered what you thought about it. As someone who's worked in this field, and probably everything you've done could be turned upside down.
Well, I mean, I think the jury's out, isn't it? I mean, I think we have to sit back and wait and see. I think there are optimists and there are pessimists. You might envisage one future where the generative artificial intelligence is really starting to make all of that boring basic science live, because it can integrate the science with individual patients. So there's a better link between learning all of that knowledge, the Krebs cycle yet again, with what does this mean in the clinical setting. So generative artificial intelligence might be a great bridge, but I think it's just too soon, and I'm probably too old. We need some 9-year-old to tell us where this is going to go. But undoubtedly, we've missed opportunities to make those bridges. The original Sackett definition of evidence-based medicine in the BMJ in 1996 was bringing in evidence to improve decision making for individual patients. And again, it was another sliding doors moment. We missed the opportunity to demonstrate actually, just how to do that. And instead of showing people how to do better consultations, what we ended up with is 400 clinical guidelines and 8,000 systematic reviews in Archie Cochrane's library. So will generative artificial intelligence help with all of that, or will it just make things up because it too can't make sense of setting the evidence in the context of individuals and what they want? I think there's still going to be that human to human connection.
So Neil, you mentioned sliding doors moment there. I've tried to tell this story before on the pod, but I want to hear it from you because it's your story. So Canoe Man.
Oh dear me. So you remember Rofecoxib, the designer NSAID that was supposed to reduce massively the GI bleeds and perforations that NSAIDs potentially cause. And that got withdrawn from the market because of an excess of cardiovascular events. And people then started to look at other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs for their effects on the cardiovascular system. And a systematic review was published in the BMJ that showed that, as far as we could tell, lots of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs did that. The exceptions being ibuprofen at standard doses and naproxen, and that still is the case. So we were looking at the data at the National Prescribing Centre, and despite the fact that there'd been this systematic review in the BMJ showing that there was this problem with the NSAIDs that people really hadn't recognised, the prescribing hadn't changed, and the Committee on Safety of Medicines had issued a warning to prescribers, and the prescribing hadn't changed. Because I'd done the cognitive psychology stuff, I was sitting there for about 20 minutes looking backwards and forwards because I'd prescribed some of these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to lots of patients myself. And I was finding it really hard to get to grips with the fact that here was a problem that we needed to do something about. Nobody else seemed to be doing it. So on the back of an envelope, I worked out that we were probably creating 2,000 avoidable or premature cardiovascular events through our use of NSAIDs that weren't naproxen and ibuprofen at standard doses. And I thought this might be quite a big thing. So I talked to the MHRA, I talked to our sponsors at the Department of Health. They all agreed with me that I was, on the money here. I wasn't, making this up. And so we wrote a Merrick Extra, actually, a prescribing bulletin. And we did quite a bit of preparation because we thought 2,000 avoidable cardiovascular deaths might be quite a story. So I had my hair cut and I pressed my suit, and I'd got 2 clean shirts in the boot of the car. And on the day we published the Merrick Extra, the thing that was on the front page of the newspapers was Canoe Man, this sad, terrible family tragedy of this guy who'd faked his own death, leaving a damaged canoe on the beach in the northeast of England, and actually lived in the attic of his house. I mean, it's a horrible story because this couple had got teenage sons, and who had been told that their father was dead when he was living in the attic. And eventually he jumped ship and went off to Panama. His wife went with him. They were going to move to buy a house in Panama. The Panamanian estate agent took a picture of them and put it on the web. And suddenly this ruse, this horrible thing was exposed. Anyway, we never got a look in the media. The Daily Mail never came looking, and all of my media preparation was completely wasted. So we ended up with a very nice natural experiment of what happens when you do academic detailing and publish a bulletin on prescribing. It's in the book.
Maybe one to think about when your press release for your book goes out.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, yeah, that is the thing about the press, isn't it? So I've actually been in conversation this week with a journalist who had contacted via something that happened through the Academic Health Science Network, who then listened to the podcast, who then asked if they could talk to me, plus one of our previous guests, about the world of structured medication reviews and polypharmacy. And without going into much detail, at the minute, we've left her with so much stuff that she's like, but I don't know how to tell this as a story that the public, and I'm trying to explain that we need to get the public on board and that they have got a choice and that their views and experiences and things are important. But she's saying, well, I don't know how to pitch it to the Daily Mail, to get it as a story. I don't know how to get it through the editor. And then I feel like I'm not doing a good enough job at being passionate about the importance of, problematic polypharmacy. It's a real challenge to get the public involved, not to get involved, but to understand where we're coming from, because it is complex, isn't it?
And we've got a long way to go. There's a chapter in the book called Mavis Like Medicine. My Auntie Mavis, 90-year-old Auntie Mavis, has taken over from my mother as the barometer of how the NHS is functioning. And I won't lead on too much, but even I struggle sometimes to persuade people to do the sort of stuff that you guys talk about all the time. What matters to the patient here is still tricky, even in a great care home.
Yeah.
Before we go on, Neil, can I give you you were right. You were right.
Once in a decade.
Yeah, no, you were right. And I remember when you came into the NPC and then sort of became medical director, there was a slight change of, I don't know, what's the word, attention to detail. And you were very nervous, weren't you? You and Jonathan, very nervous about what people were saying on behalf of the centre and the unit, what people were writing. And at the time, I was thinking, that maybe a bit, because it'd been working fine up until then as well, and and I thought maybe a bit over the top. But boy, it came back to bite us, didn't it? With that, we were both involved in that court case.
Indeed.
And where every email that we'd sent, it turns out, was all retrievable, and every document that it was incredible. I was blown away.
Imagine
by
the WhatsApp messages now.
Well, indeed, I was blown away by how. That research and how the evidence pull that they did for that case, and I just thought, wow, that it was all there, wasn't it?
We were very keen, and it was. We don't want to be appearing on the front page of the Daily Mail, and we don't want to get involved in judicial review, because we were a tiny small unit with a tiny small budget, and we were very keen to avoid getting sucked into that, just because we'd then spend all of our time and effort and resources on refuting either against the media or actually in court. So we did put a lot of effort into making sure that what we wrote and what we said was defendable. But yes, it was a bit of a shock to see an email that I'd written 20 years previously appear in my inbox with a we're going to court about this.
Yeah, who's keeping those?
We should just I was just going to say, we should just say for the non-healthcare listener that when we talk about the NPC, this was the National Prescribing Centre that Neal was the lead for. And it was almost what came before NICE, really, and then sort of got subsumed into it. But so for the purposes of non-health professional people, it was a great resource that a lot of us talk about how good it was, because it looked at the evidence and it tried to help clinicians to understand it, to then be able to put it into language that they could then discuss with their individual patients. So Neal and Jonathan Underhill, who you might remember we've had on the podcast, they were very heavily involved, plus many others, but Neal led it, and it was a wondrous thing, and that's why we go back to it. And so not because we're all looking backwards, because we all believe in looking forwards, but the structure of how it went about it hasn't changed, and you can't make decisions unless you know what the evidence is, but then you need to be able to discuss it and put it into the understanding of that person's values and preferences. So yeah, that's why we go on about it so much.
My one regret is that we didn't do a little bit of evaluation of what was going on at the time. But as you say, Jamie, I think a day in the witness box in the High Court and winning that case is probably a pretty good evaluation that what we did was good. The judge was very kind in his remarks and his summing up about the stuff that we'd done. So I think we got away with it.
Yeah, and I mean, we talk to Jonathan about this quite frequently, but the MPC, not the car parks, as one of our dear friends Steve Willis would always ask me. He says, "You still working for those car park people?" But we chat. Steve Willis, rest in peace. Jonathan and I chat about how good that training cascade was and how good that training network was. I think one of the top things I've been involved in my career, without a doubt.
Well, we had a great bunch of people, and the person who doesn't get enough credit for all that stuff was our chief exec, Clive Jackson. Clive was, really ahead of his time. I think he pulled a great team together and then stood back and let us get on with it for the most part. And bless him, I saw him a few months ago, and it was great to see him looking so well and happy.
The last thing I just wanted to say before perhaps we move on. I often give Jonathan Underhill a hard time about this because, as you know, he works as a consultant for NICE. But you beautifully talk about it in the book, about this thing. Let's call it the terms and conditions, shall we, of NICE guidance. And this idea that if you look carefully, like in the terms and conditions of all the stuff you've ever bought that you never read, but you just signed at the bottom to say that you read it, it does say, even though the evidence might suggest that we'd strongly suggest you consider or offer this medicine to a person, even a statin, for example, it does quite clearly state that the clinician does still need to think about it and to use their clinical judgment. But that's the bit that's getting lost, isn't it? And that's what your point in the book is very clearly puts across, in that we've another, like you just said before about all these sliding doors, and we missed an opportunity. We missed the opportunity. The terms and conditions should be in font 40 on the front of every guidance, not in font 7 on the last page of the guidance.
We're still missing that opportunity. If most people don't read even the NICE guidelines, so they don't see that paragraph at all, and even those who see it, it doesn't impact upon their frontal cortex. It's not the front. They see the instructions in the guideline to offer or consider, and they follow them as the way to manage that particular condition. But actually, what people do use are the British National Formulary and clinical knowledge summaries. And there's nothing in those that supports shared decision making. Not even a statement that says this doesn't supplant individual decision making, taking into account the values and preferences. There's no patient decision aids in the BNF, for example. So there's just in terms of the technical support that we're providing for people, we're a long way from where we could be.
Very good point, actually, yeah.
We have chatted about this before, but, I was one of the sort of people who used to go along to Jamie's and others' workshops who were cascading a lot of the MPC stuff, and then was tasked with sitting in a room with a GP trying to pass on that information. And I think, we did get it wrong sometimes in the way we messaged it, and and I think that's what happened on a bigger scale, wasn't it? It's sort of the evidence-based movement got slightly twisted from here's some evidence to help you make a decision to here's the decision you should make in these circumstances. And I think we veered on and off that track ever since because it's just difficult, isn't it?
I'm just back from holiday, and I read the most wonderful book on holiday about just how to blend the two together. And I don't think anybody's mentioned it on this podcast yet. It's not my book. I've got another book to come to.
Well, you can mention it then in that case.
A Fortunate Woman by Polly Morland. It's amazing.
You can't say that.
Well, it's wonderful. It's terrific. It's the best book.
Yeah, you're far too eloquent and intellectual to use a word like amazing, Neil.
But it stitches together these two things better than anything that it's the story of a country doctor in the Wye Valley just before the pandemic and during the pandemic. I won't spoil the thing, but it's been way up in the non-fiction charts and already listed for non-fiction prizes. And if somebody doesn't mention it as their book for Series 6, they're missing a trick. It's just the bee's knees.
Give it to us again.
A Fortunate Woman, Polly Morland.
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
Okay, great stuff, Neil. We will probably, I'm sure, come back to these themes again later on in the podcast. But for now, I'm sure you're aware that you get 3 things as an oral apothecary guest. And the first one that we're after is a desert island drug. So this is for the oral apothecary formulary. So a drug that evokes a powerful memory from either your life or perhaps your health journey. So what would you like to offer us?
Well, I was going to pick midazolam as a representative of those medicines that help us through horrible things like procedures and all that sort of stuff. There's a great story involving me, midazolam, the Queen of the Belgians, and about 6 paramedics and a couple of ER doctors. But I'm not going to tell that story tonight.
Okay.
I'm going to pick imatinib for chronic myeloid leukemia because it's a great, joyous story of drug development.
Good. We haven't had a nib. We've had a mab, but we haven't had a nib.
And I did play a small part in smoothing its introduction into UK practice.
Okay.
So we
ahead.
go back. So we go back to the late 80s, early 90s, and there's a young oncologist in Boston called Brian Drucker. And he's got a research job at Harvard, so he's clearly, very bright as an oncology researcher. And his big thing is that cancers and leukemias exert their effects because the cells divide quicker than non-cancerous, non-leukemic cells. And there's something that is switching these cells on. There's some sort of chemical messenger that's switching on cell division in these. And he's making a bit of progress. All of this stuff happens with people standing on the shoulders of giants. It's not just his work. There's other research coming together from other teams. And he's actually making quite a bit of progress. But his academic supervisor at Harvard isn't impressed. He thinks it's unrealistic, and he's told he's not going to get academic progression with this line of research. So instead of kowtowing to his academic supervisor, he starts looking for somewhere else where he can carry on with this research. And he ends up in Portland, Oregon, largely because Portland, Oregon is great for running and great for cycling. It's where Nike had set up their headquarters and things. And basically, Brian Drucker worked, ran and cycled, and that was his life. He'd had some conversations with some pharmaceutical companies already. So there'd been a sort of an initial movement towards starting to create a few potential medicines that might work. And pretty soon after he got to Portland, he made another step forward. And he talked to a previous contact at Ciba-Geigy, a brilliant British-born biochemist called Nicholas Lydon, who eventually quite soon sent over some promising potential medicines. And Brian was still trucking through the years of drug development, and he ended up with one potential medicine called ST1571, which then caused hepatitis in dogs, which was another delay to getting this into clinical research. And eventually, that's a red herring. So by 1998, Brian Drucker and his team have got 31 patients with chronic myeloid leukemia lined up for the first use in humans of this potential medicine. And they were all living within 10 minutes of the hospital in downtown Portland. Now, some of these people were in their 40s. They had young children. They'd all, most of them anyway, had treatment with the standard treatment at the time, which was interferon, which we all know is just a nasty medicine to have and take. Indeed, some of them have been told by their doctors, I think we'll stop the interferon, that's killing you faster than the leukemia. They'd all had to put their affairs in order. They all knew that they had an 80% chance of dying within 2 years, and nobody lived 10 years. And it's an impossible situation. And Brian Drucker started the trial with ST1571 in 31 patients. And in 3 months, 30 out of the 31 patients had complete hematological remission. Their cancer had disappeared in 30 people out of 31. They looked at the 31st patient, and this patient was taking an anti-epileptic drug, and they had a look at his reason for taking it and decided he didn't need it. They stopped the epileptic drug, and he went into complete hematological remission. This is unheard of. This is a big, big thing. So we fast forward to January 2001, and it's a wet January afternoon, and I'm in the NPC meeting room at Liverpool, and I'm meeting with some representatives from Novartis the drug company, and they're trying to tell me how great their angiotensin 2 receptor blocker is. I think it's valsartan. And really, it's a perfectly good drug. It's just not a huge breakthrough and no better than the existing angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. And of course, I'm trying to escape the meeting, and then there's a moment, a bit like when a patient puts their hand on the door and says, "Whilst I'm here, could I just ask you?" Because then you're going to discover something really quite important, and then you stop and listen. And the equivalent of that was the guys from Novartis saying something like, "Thanks for all that, Neil. Whilst we're here, could we just show you these results that have just come through? Because they're pretty unusual, and we've got a problem we need some help with." And these were the extended trials of what had become imatinib. So what had happened was that Ciba-Geigy had been taken over by Novartis, and Novartis were going to pull the plug on the development of imatinib. They didn't see it as a commercial opportunity. And the patients petitioned the chief executive of Novartis. Judy Oram was one of the leaders of the patients, and they persuaded Novartis to reinvest and even accelerate the production of imatinib for these trials in hundreds of patients this time in Portland, in New York, and in London. And what we saw in those trials, it took me about 5 minutes to recognise that what they got was something that turned a condition with a 95% mortality rate into a condition that in 95% of patients, at least in the short term, was a manageable chronic condition. And, there are people alive today in that cohort from 1998. Judy Oram sits on the FDA committees when they're discussing new medicines for chronic myeloid leukemia. This is fantastic work by Byron Drucker and actually by the pharmaceutical companies. It's at least as impressive a piece of work as Robin Warren and Barry Marshall for H. pylori and peptic ulcers, and Françoise Barry-Sanusi for the antiretrovirals for HIV. Warren and Marshall and Barry Sanusi got the Nobel Prize, and so your Scandinavian listener might need to wake up a bit, talk to their friends at the Karolinska Institute. Why haven't Brian Drucker, Nicholas Lydon, and actually Judy Oram as the patient representative, acknowledging the work that patients put into these randomized controlled trials? Why don't those three get the Nobel Prize for imatinib?
Wow, fair enough. We had a patient on recently who had cystic fibrosis and talked to us about, it was a very joyful episode about Kaftrio. And we were saying about, sometimes myself included can be quite scathing sometimes of the pharmaceutical industry for marginal gains. But I think what we're all saying here is that when you see something that actually is a game changer, and it doesn't really matter how much it costs, because it's such a game changer that you then got to go with it. And we've got to go with both, haven't we? We've got the marginal gains, but let's be honest, that's not a good use of money. Whereas actually, if we can use the money for massive wins like this, and this is a great example. I didn't know the exact story of imatinib, but yeah, you can definitely have the first nib in the formulary because you've had a couple of MABs actually.
Just to finish up my little bit, was Novartis had got 400 patients on compassionate use in the UK. And that what they were worried about was 600 primary care groups in England, some of them saying no when this drug came through licensing, which was happening at a record pace. So we sort of smoothed the path through the Department of Health Service circular went out, and as far as I know, nobody got their treatment interrupted for commissioning reasons. So that was my little bit, and it was only a little bit, but crikey, Brian Drucker. Good man.
Well, I'm looking forward to your book even more now, Neil, because you tell a great story, and maybe that's your second book is the stories behind the big drugs, because you tell it very well.
They're all in there.
Oh, are they?
That's
okay.
actually not a bad book. That's not a bad book idea, actually, is it? Because there's lots of great drugs. You want to get James McCormack in, I think, on the editorial board as well. It's not a bad idea, actually. Ooh.
And a Nobel Prize in sight now that we've got the considerable weight of the Oral Apothecary behind that campaign.
In Scandinavia, yeah.
We'll get our social team onto that.
Brian Drucker, you don't need to thank us.
Right, excellent. Yeah, and a great story. So the second thing, Neil, is that we're after an anthem, a career anthem. So what would you like to offer us for the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist that really is on Spotify?
There was only one candidate. So summer of 1970. It's almost ancient history, isn't it? I had a summer job. I was waiting for my A-level results. So I had a summer job restoring a large garden attached to a house that had been occupied for a couple of years. So there was the couple that looked after the house, there was the gardener and the housekeeper. So I self-titled myself as assistant head gardener for the summer, knocking this house into shape. But my dad bought a record player. Prior to then, we'd only had the radio. My dad bought a record player. And I think he probably regretted it, because the first record I went out and bought was the second album by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Deja Vu, a classic West Coast rock. And there were loads of songs on that. You know, it spoke to me down the years, and one of which really, in the last 20 years, has taken hold, because 20 years ago, the dearly beloved Helen and I got together here in Southport, and there's a track on that album written by Graham Nash when he'd moved from England and left the Hollies behind, and he was living in Laurel Canyon in Joni Mitchell's house with Joni Mitchell, and it was sort of domestic bliss for a short while. And one rainy Saturday morning, they went out for breakfast, and Graham Nash persuaded Joni to buy a vase, an antique vase that she had admired in a shop. And they went back to the house, and Graham Nash sat down at Joni's piano and wrote, "I'll light the fire. You place the flowers in the vase that you bought today." And there were bits of that song that Helen and I sang to each other from the early days here. Two cats in the yard, life used to be so hard. And we had two cats in the yard for a while, our cat and Helen's dad's cat, when unfortunately he passed. So when we finally decided, after 19 years minus 3 days, to eventually tie the knot last autumn, there was only one song to pick. And we walked up the aisle together to get married to Our House by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Very good.
Wow.
I must admit that I'm not a big Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young fan, but musical I know that they were. I only know Our House by Madness, but that's because I'm a bit younger than you.
Well, you were born in the summer of 1970, Steve.
I was born in the summer of 1970, so there is a link there.
Nothing to do with me.
We go back full circle to my dad, who I mentioned at the start of the pod, because that's one of the albums I think that's in his collection. So I used to listen to them as a kid as well.
There you go. Yeah, they're incredibly tuneful. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I say excellent. And we're always looking for we're looking for something that's got a personal memory, and so there's nothing more personal than that, is there? So thank you.
We were lucky enough to see Dave Crosby and Graham Nash at the Philharmonic Hall in Liverpool the last time that Dave Crosby came over to the UK. So yeah, lots of personal stuff relating to.
Okay, well, it'll sound great. As we always say, it's a really eclectic mix of stuff in the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist, so I know it will sit nicely in there. So that's Our House by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Very good. Our micro discussion next then. Did you get a chance to look at the article in the Sunday Times, Neil? The NHS is flatlining. Here's how to save it right now.
I did, yes.
And what would you like to add to what's gone before? And again, I think this is the latter half of Rebalancing Medicine that will be in all good bookshops within the next 12 months. Should we read out what's gone before, STC? Should we do that again for the listener?
Yes, okay. So this is for the now called the hashtag NHS75 Oral Apothecary Tonic. So we've got support, then trust patients as project managers for their own health, Graham Prestwich. Treat the person, not the condition, by Deborah Duval. All decisions should be shared, Alf Collins. Communicate with patients better, Rachel Power. Utilise community pharmacists more for diagnosis and treatment triage, Trevor Sylvester. Treat mental health as seriously as physical health, Liz O'Riordan. Manage the child to adult services journey better for children with long-term conditions, Louise Jenkins. Better support NHS organisations to adopt evidence-based improvements in patient care by Paul Woodgate. And Fund the lived experience sector to help other patients and clinicians by Louise Trewern.
So on the list, the Sean Linton list, I mean, there's a couple of those suggestions that I would absolutely endorse, and I talk about them quite a lot in the book. Number 10 is look after staff. And it's just some horrible, horrible stories about, how things operate in some organisations still. And yeah, Charles Massey, the chief executive of the General Medical Council, said in November 22, doctors are not leaving UK practice because they've fallen out of love with medicine. Instead, it is because they can't tolerate the environments in which it is practiced. The problem is not their work, it's their workplace. And it's awful that we've got to that sort of situation. The one above, suspend inspections, I mean, I'd add, cut right back on appraisal and revalidation and pay for performance, that sort of thing. A few weeks ago, where an English GP, they got to submit 233 bits of data in a year in order to claim all of the allowances that for their practice. So there's all of that sort of over data, over inspection, over coercive industrialized approach to medicine. But the one I would add to this, which is what you're after, the one I'd add to this...
Can I just stop you there for a second, Neil, just to add to something and just build on that last point, because you've commented on the RCGP overdiagnosis group on this one a few times, and it fits with what you've just said, is that this concept of time needed to treat. Yeah, so we've seen a few published articles on it now, but the time needed to treat. Do you want to explain a bit more about your understanding of that?
So this is Mina Johansson in Sweden. Come on, Mina, get onto the Karolinska Institute. It's such a great paper. I'm sure you'll put it in the notes. And so many of us wish we'd written this paper before it came out now. Basically, it's to do with calculating the capacity that the system has to carry out the recommendations in, say, a guideline. And the latest bit from Mina and team is that they've gone through all the NICE guidelines and looked at the recommendations for providing what we might call lifestyle advice to patients, and totted them all up and worked out how long it would take to provide that lifestyle advice to the target population as identified in the guideline. And astonishingly, what they've calculated is that if the NHS gave up treating anybody who was ill, there still wouldn't be enough people to deliver the lifestyle advice that's included within those guidelines. And we have to stand back and look at this, don't we? We can't go on heaping more and more and more onto a workforce and actually, a population who actually have different priorities to these. We had information mastery in the 1990s and the 2000s, but goodness me, we need to do something about the capacity in the system and marrying that up with the recommendations that are made. That's the time needed to treat stuff. It's a brilliant concept. Victor Montori from the States is involved as well, but I've had some emails with Mina and she's very keen.
Surely that's the heavy lifting that we possibly need digital and AI to help us with. We're not saying that we don't need to get these public health messages out there, but it's the time involved and there are other ways of potentially doing it. I think that's what we're saying, isn't it?
And the Michael Marmot stuff, I'm not saying we abandon all prevention, but, why don't we do something about making decent food available for people at reasonable cost and enabling people to walk and cycle, housing, reduction in income inequalities, all of that might, helping, children in their early years, all of that stuff is as much prevention as the technical approach that dominates prevention. Again, we're too much on the science and the technology, which inevitably ends up with false positive and false negative tests, which people ignore in their view of prevention being a really good thing. The problem is, of course, all of this, the social approach to prevention is longer term, and we need a better concordat about how we go about these things, I think.
And if you like the cut of Neil's jib of what he's talking about, then you should read his book when it comes out, quite simply.
I'll let you know if it comes out. It's going to come out.
Give me what were you going to say, sorry?
Well, it was more back to the first point you made about treating the staff well. And I think today is the first or the second day of the latest junior doctor strike. And the headline that's portrayed is the junior doctors are asking for 35%, and it's the same when they talk about nurses and stuff. But actually, when you look at what they're looking at, that's not what's bothering most people. It's what you describe, isn't it, Neil? It's what they're being asked to do, that they know that they're spending so much time on crap that they're not able to treat patients. And I mentioned that we had an improvement conference in my health board today. And so I spent a lot of the last year talking to people like, what could we really do to help you? And I've come to the conclusion that the biggest, people joke about the bureaucracy in the NHS, and I'm started to call it the sludge. But it's actually the biggest patient safety issue that I can see out there at the moment is the amount of time that people are spending doing stuff that doesn't add any value, that not only doesn't add value because it wastes time, it just depresses the people who are doing it. So I'm spot on with you on that. I think it's not just about making work a happier place, it's about removing all this crap that's just built up over the years. And I'm really interested in what you said there, 222 articles. I'll have to find that piece because it's just it's laughable, but it's not laughable.
It's if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. It's not where we're on. And there is a great paper by Don Berwick, the previously mentioned Don Berwick from the conference last week, Jamie. He talks about the 3 eras of medicine, one being you've got it in front of you, good man.
Indeed.
The first one would be the era where implicit competence was assumed. We all know where that ended up. The second era we're in now, where the response to all the catastrophes there have been in medicine is this over-dependence upon paperwork and inspection and data and all that sort of stuff. And he talks in that paper very eloquently about there needing to be a third era where things are a bit more rebalanced, as a good title for a book.
Yeah, everything's reimagined, Neil. Nothing's new anymore. It's just reimagined.
So Don Berwick's message to conference was, there's no hero coming. This is, we're all in it together. Patients, public, healthcare professionals.
That's good. Yeah,
we're all, don't be waiting for a hero, because they ain't coming. And then this morning on Breakfast TV, the junior doctors were on, and it's the first time really that they've used... They're normally going with relative rate increases that they're asking for, aren't they? They're asking for 30-odd%. So this morning, the junior doctor representative from the BMA, I think, explained that actually what they're asking for is to move from £14 something an hour up to the outrageous number of £19 something an hour.
Messaging.
And when I heard that this morning, I thought, that's the message. Because who begrudges your junior doctors earning £19 something an hour rather than a 30-odd% increase? You know, and so we've spent a career out talking about relative risk reduction and absolute risk reduction and harm.
And guess what? Absolute makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? If you give it as the absolute, then actually it makes a lot more sense.
So, Neil, we interrupted you there. What were you going to give us as your final addition to the tonic? The final addition, I won't say that. Final addition to the tonic.
Well, it's really an extension of what we were talking about earlier in the way that guidelines are currently constructed. And I would ban guideline committees from making recommendations on a do, not do, offer, consider basis. I think guideline committees should review the evidence, describe the benefits in absolute terms in just the way that we've just been talking, £14 to £19, and then help patients and healthcare professionals to see how that might improve the consultation. What would that information, let's give some examples of how using that evidence in a consultation will actually help with a better decision, rather than do not do population level type stuff. So ban guidelines from making recommendations.
Okay, I was going to say, my word, I was trying to come up with a shorthand little phrase, so thank you for qualifying that. So ban guidelines committees from coming up with recommendations.
So that's a blanket ban then?
Which is James McCormack says the same thing, doesn't he? I've heard James McCormack argue the same thing.
Yeah, we've talked online and we've actually met face-to-face in Vancouver. And, James is really ahead of the game in many ways. The Canadians are actually starting to do this with their primary care guidelines. So it's not as if this is some, airy-fairy mad idea. This is actually, the future is present. It's just not evenly distributed yet.
So did you say this is happening in Canada, or?
Yeah.
And so what's the response been of the clinicians there then? Because I can imagine some people welcome it, and I can imagine some people saying, please tell me what to do.
But that's right, isn't it? That's exactly why some of the guidelines on the evidence-based medicine stuff is so popular. Even now, with doctors acquiring their expertise, because it solves some of their problems, it solves some of their difficulties. So in a way, we have to move beyond it and paint a picture for people why doing the treatment for everybody is actually the wrong thing for some of them, especially when we end up with the multimorbidity stuff that we've talked about already.
Okay. Definitely, that can go in, no problem at all.
I think it's a great one.
Very good. A big thank you to Neal for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing his stories, his desert island drug, his career anthem. That's it for Series 5. Thanks to all our guests who've joined us over the last 6 months. Thanks once again to the team behind the team. You know who you are. In particular, Jimbo Slough and Jacob Howard. Thanks to you, the listener. We know you continue to listen from all over the globe. As always, thank you for your time, support, feedback and encouragement. We'll be back with Series 6 after STC and I have returned from Rugby World Cup in France.
Yes.
If you'd like to input your ideas and suggestions for Series 6, then we'd love to hear from you. STC will ignore most of them, but don't let that stop you. You can contact us via Twitter at Oral Apothecary. We're on LinkedIn. Visit the website, theoralapothecary.com, and you can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com. Over to Neal now for the final ingredient.
Well, the sharp-witted and regular listeners will have realised that we haven't talked about a book, and other than my book. A book for the library, and what I've picked is not a book. It's an online collection of writings about sharing personal experience of giving and receiving healthcare. This is pulsevoices.org. It's a United States orientated website run by Paul Gross and Diane Guernsey. Paul's a teacher of family medicine, interested in narrative medicine. Diane's his wife and an editor, and they started this in 2008. It's a free subscription, 1 email a week, floats into your inbox. You don't always have to open it. I would say I probably open mine about 50% of the time. If my heart or my head or both are too full, I don't go to it, but I'm always glad when I do go to it. There are anthologies, there are collections that are available for purchase, either directly from pulsevoices.org or on your usual online seller of things like books. It's been a great comfort to me when I've been overwhelmed with the science and technology and the madness of the way medicine happens to read some of these stories, because it's about how things happen in the real world, not how things are expected to happen for a population. And it brings me down to earth every time I find the time and the energy to open up the email. They will accept donations, but it's not obligatory. So I've got permission from Paul and Diane and from the author of this piece just to read a short example that will hopefully bookend the series. This is by Margie Hodges Shaw, and Margie teaches consultation skills in Upper New York State, often working with people who are doing palliative care, both undergraduate and postgraduate learners. But this isn't about her work. This is about her mother, who has had a long-standing lung disease and been admitted to a big, very busy Atlanta hospital in the middle of a COVID wave. She doesn't have COVID, but she's been admitted in the middle of a COVID wave. And it's called Living and Letting Go in the ICU. As my brother and I stood at our mother's bedside, the nurses kept asking if we'd considered transferring her to the local hospice facility. They were reading my mind. How could they know how much I wished Mom to have a peaceful environment in her last days and a good death? My brother, on the other hand, hoped that our mother would continue to have a good life. She'd recently moved in with his family. He and his loving wife spent months cooking and caring for Mom while she played gin rummy with their kids and dispensed wisdom and advice, welcome or not. I have a phone full of photos of them smiling and raising wine glasses over meals. They had plans to build a small backyard cottage for Mom as a way of meeting her increasing needs whilst also respecting her strong opinions and fierce desire for independence. My brother couldn't envision our Mom dying. He could only see her living. Part of me was painfully jealous of his perspective. My mother had full decisional capacity. She'd already told the medical team that she refused intubation and chest compressions. Lung disease is often invisible to others. For many years, Mum managed her illness with sophistication and grace. She took extraordinarily good care of herself, rarely looked sick, and frequently had to remind others of her physical limitations. She instructed her doctors and advanced care providers how to treat her. 4 days into her ICU stay with her breathing ability deteriorating, my mother still retained full mental capacity. My brother and I took turns staying at her bedside. I read out loud to her from The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating, a book she'd recently discovered and loved. I suspect that the story about a bedridden patient who found solace made Mom feel less alone and even lucky. I'll never forget the joy in her face as I fed her ice cream from the hospital cafeteria. Later that night, she seemed restless. Worried about her comfort, I asked if she wanted medications. She was slow to respond, and I eventually asked, "Do you want me to decide for you?" She turned her head, looked me straight in the eye, and said clearly, "No, I do not." Next morning, she awoke confused. After orientated her to her surroundings, the nurses and I asked if she needed anything. "A new brain would help," she scoffed. And this is where I most wish for a talented songwriter. This story deserves a love song. In a just world, my mother could have been or done anything she wanted. Her exquisite observational skills, clean financial acumen, shrewd critical thinking, and entrepreneurial spirit could have propelled her to the top of any organisation. Instead, she gave her family everything. I imagine that it was hard to parent me, a daughter she perceived of as being in a constant fight with the world. A Dolly Parton song might gracefully capture the relationships that developed over time and distance, climaxed in an ICU, and continue today. A song celebrating complex love, grief, and gratitude. At the end, there was nothing to fight. All I could do was to give her what she had really always given me, unconditional love and support. Her last words to me were, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." Critical care providers and nurses and the intensive care setting enabled this. Everyday critical care delivered in the midst of a pandemic, where I had expected to find exhaustion and numbness. I witnessed remarkable care delivered with kindness. As grateful as I feel for the peace and quiet and care she received there, the gifts from our ICU stay are the ones I hold most dear. To the critical care providers and nurses who compassionately treat all patients, whether they are likely to live or likely to die, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
This was a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough. Original music Jamie Brewster. Artwork by David Baker.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. Caution, you may spontaneously combust if you take it too literally.
This episode of The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by OneLessPill.com and Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching.